All right, well, again, thanks for being here, everybody. There's coffee there. I already just said that, didn't I? So yeah, let me, if you don't mind, I'll just open in prayer. I don't know if anybody else is going to be coming. I didn't get any emails from anybody, but that's the downside of recording it and knowing that I'm going to send it out. Is people are like, oh, I'll just watch it. No, I'm kidding. I have no idea why they're not here, but that's okay.
But how can I ask lots of stupid questions?
I know, yeah. How do you get to do that? I know, right? I know it. All right, let me pray for us, and then we'll jump into week 3. Heavenly Father, thank you for just another opportunity to gather together to explore what Genesis says about who you are as a powerful God and powerful Creator. I pray that just give all of us clarity and reason. So much of Scripture and so many of the writers and the Apostle Paul and others that we don't need to shy away from deep thinking. We don't need to be afraid of this, and I just pray that it would be a time of encouragement, that we would walk out of here more in love with you than we are right now. And so, we'd just be honored and glorified as we dig into this topic, and it's Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. Not to call you out, but Sam, as you put candy in your mouth, I'm going to call you out if you don't mind. We kind of went around the room week 1 and just said, hey, here's my name. That's Sam, everyone. And you can go. Feel free to just why you weren't here the last couple weeks, and then if you were to say again, the way we worded it was, what did you believe, or what was a position you once had? Maybe it's the same position, but if you have a position or had a position, what was that, if you don't mind? And then just why you're here, just why you're excited to take this class.
Okay, we work with a group called the Navigators, and we were in Mexico for 42 years. We came back 2 years ago, but we still make trips. So I was in Mexico the last 2 weeks. And I was raised in a totally pagan home, and so by the time I got to the university, I just knew evolution was true. I mean, I'd seen it every year. And it was all the little pictures and stuff that gets bigger and bigger, and so that's where I was.
Yeah.
All right.
That's not where I am now.
Okay. All right. And then why are you here now?
Oh, because I love the topic and I wanted to see it presented.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, we're glad to have you, Sam. All right. Any questions that came up from last week that you were ruminating on, or the last couple weeks? Anything that might be able to help with in some way, give some clarity on?
I think for me it was like I watched the video and then we were like listened a little bit on the way here. But like just real quick, because I remember when I thought I listened, like where did like Adam and Eve like come into play
Within theistic evolution? So again, if you're gonna go branch it off from, at some point you had the whatever species it was, and again, Neanderthal or whatever that is, I don't know what that is. That at some point they're going to have a child that's going to be the first human, and that this one is also, by just natural selection, yada yada yada, they're also going to have a child. And so the Genesis narrative of God forming Eve, breathing breath in him, taking a rib and Adam, and then taking a rib and creating Eve, that's all just metaphorical. It's story. It's not to be read even remotely literally. And so as they have evolved into humans, they're the first humans. They're the Adam and Eve. That makes sense. And there could have been at the same time then a lot of humans that would have been at the same time. But then again, this would not be crossbreeding. So if a human then also married a Neanderthal type human, whatever, I'm mixing my language up, that still would have happened, I would imagine. So if that makes sense.
It does, perfect.
Okay. Anything else?
And like the one thing that I find interesting when I did like a world religions class is they talk about all the different religions and how many other religions have somewhat similar, have similarities in the creation story.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say they probably align the closest to the theistic evolution aspect of seeing it as metaphorical or representational, where Adam and Eve were just of the humans. So that's an interesting, it was a class taught by agnostic, and so her perspective probably spoke to creation, like the Christian creation story, more in line with that. That was just interesting.
Yeah, so next week we actually will look at very specific, like I'll read the history from the Canaanites and we'll compare the stories, and which I think is very fascinating and eye-opening. And so anyways, we will get into that, which is always fun. All right, week 3, we're going to be kicking off here Historic Creationism, and we'll just jump right in here to kind of the main points. Again, the sine qua non, if you will, of this position. There's going to be a little overlap with what's called the gap theory, but I'm going to explain that because it's different from another position that's also called the gap theory. It can get kind of confusing because it's the same name.
So these are two separate things, the gap and the historic creation.
So they are, but I'll explain that. So specifically, this is historic creationism, and then there's a lot of overlap though with this and what used to be called the gap theory. Now the gap theory is a little bit different, but yeah. Okay, so three main points, kind of the same when we boil it down between theistic evolution and creationism. And the first one is around the Bible. Well, let's go to the age of the earth. We'll just start with that one, right? Any guesses what historic creationism is going to believe? Old earth, young earth? Old earth, okay? So they're going to look at the age of the earth and they're going to say, yep, it's old to me, based on science and everything else, right? So when we take this view, let me pause on my mid-thought there. When we look at historic creationism compared to the other weeks, there is still a lot of overlap. So when it comes to the science, a lot of what we're going to learn tonight, so we're not going to be getting into atom decay and how do we figure out the age of the earth tonight. That's already been done. And they're going to say, hey, I agree with the theistic evolution perspective that we heard last week on the age of the earth. It's going to differentiate though, okay, so old earth, but then the other aspect then is life itself, that there is no macroevolution in this. Microevolution, sure, obviously, that's proven every day. So we're not talking microevolution, yes, thumbs up. Macroevolution with the speciations of, species? That can't be right. Speciation of creatures, of life, that is not a thing, of the idea of macroevolution. So that's going to be the life. And then when it comes to the Bible and interpreting Genesis, as we're going to see tonight, they're going to take a literal interpretation of Genesis, and they're going to argue, or I'm going to argue, that it is the most literal of interpreting the book of Genesis. Far more literal than even the young earth creationists, because they're not going to get into the Hebrew language the way that we're going to tonight. Hey, yippee. And so, again, not a Hebrew scholar, but it is quite fascinating. So, those are kind of the three aspects that where you can see some overlap between some of them, right? You can do young earth, okay, literal interpretation of Genesis, and just the historical account and accuracy of it, written by Moses. They're not going to argue that position. They're not going to say, oh, there's all these different theories. We'll get into that a little bit next week. But they're going to say, nope, this is a reliable Word of God. Let's read it the way it was intended to be, but let's get into a little bit more of the historical setting around it, of why Moses wrote it. And that'll also be next week, so I don't want to get ahead of myself. But then as they look at the age of the earth, they're then going to look at what we studied last week and go, oh yeah, well, science, we can study the breakdown of this aspect of radiation, right? We can see that this turns into this over, and the half-life is 700,000 years old, and bada bing, bada boom, we're good to go, and we're okay with 4.5 billion years. But they're not going to agree, though, with Darwin and Darwinian theory of, again, speciation. And that's not how we arrive at the age of the earth. We can do that through geology and the fossil record and all of that, But when it comes to the macroevolution, not a thing. Not part of this dialogue at all. Okay, so I kind of started with the first view of being about as conservative as you can get, and then getting into then last week of, okay, this is about as close to being as liberal as I can get with throwing a little bit of God in there, and then this week specifically going to say let's try to do a little bit of both. Okay, all right. So let's look at just the Genesis account. I'm going to try my best to follow my outline here, but you never know. At least I never know. Okay, so let me get into why. Any ideas why this might be called historic creationism? History.
Is this what would have been believed like by the early church? And
Yeah. This has been around for a long time, for thousands of years. Before Darwin was anywhere near talking about evolution, that this would have been how a lot of people, a lot of early church fathers, again, Augustine was one of the big ones, and now I can't think of any off the top of my head, but they would have interpreted the Genesis account as literal, and it's going to be an actual literal 7 24-hour days, okay, as we'll get into, but an old earth. Okay, and that was the position for a long time. I don't have it. I could have found it. You can do it on your own. No homework. But the Catholic Church actually has a lot specifically on this point. I don't think they call it historic creationism, but they're going to say, yep, 7 literal days with old earth. That is kind of the official position of the church, but it's not, as we talked about week 1. It's not a big deal within the church. So. That's that. Okay, and not to be confused with gap theory. So gap theory is going to say we've got day 1, 2, 3, 4. You get the idea. Gap theory that we're going to be not going to be looking at tonight, this idea is that, and I was actually talking about this with my wife, and she was like, I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense, and maybe you can figure out why. Is that there are large gaps in between the days. That could be millions, billions of years. So in the beginning, and God said, let there be light. That's day 1. And then time goes by. There's a huge gap in between the days. That's why it's called the gap theory. Make sense? So there are huge gaps in between the days that allows for time to take place. What would be maybe some of the obvious glaring arguments, which is why I'm not necessarily teaching this position. Anything come to mind?
Just the idea that like you have things that just don't really coincide with like physical realities as we know them. Like there's light, but there's no stars and suns, for example, in the beginning, and then I'm drawing a blank, but just kind of that.
yeah.
Question on defining gap theory first. Is it like there is a 24-hour day that God created the light, and then time, and then there's a 24-hour.
No. So that is the other aspect that's called the day. It's called the day-age theory. Okay, meaning that this day 1 is the whole day is billions of years or however long, right? So the gap is, yes, 24-hour, boom, or whatever time it was, and then you've got all this time, and then you've got day 2. And then all this time, and then day 3, all this time. So yes, but then there's also then called the day-age theory that's going to say each day is not 24 hours, which that obviously then opens up its own problems with what about morning and evening, and it was the first day, right? It seems to be specific. Even without the sun, moon, and stars, the word day and morning and evening are used, and so I don't know. It's hard to say, well, there was thousands or millions and billions of years in morning and evening was the first day. That language you just can't get around. So again, both of these are trying to bridge the gap, no pun intended, between evolution and creation. They just fall short. They're not widely accepted. I don't know anybody who holds these views personally, and I've only read about them in theory and theology books, just as this is also a view, but I've never read a book from that perspective because I don't think they even exist.
What were you gonna point to? And you said like, what's the main thing that's a criticism? Or
Oh, just what you said, right? Of like, because again, you've got the creation of plants on day 3, and if you're waiting billions of years to get sunlight, potentially on day 4, or and again, and the day thing, right? So you got a combination of both those things that just kind of go, I don't know. It seems like a, and that's just those are like the big ones. And then you start, then they also have the same problems the other views have, and it's like, all right, I'm not sold. Yeah. All right, let's get into this word, which you probably all know. Did I spell it right? Probably not. Ex nihilo. Any idea? You guys probably know this. All you Latin fans? Yeah, okay. Out of nothing. Now, this is a cool Latin word. It's a cool phrase, out of nothing. It's very popular. A lot of people know about this phrase. However, can something come from nothing? Right? When we even looked at last week and what they brought up with theistic evolution, if I'm only an evolutionist, then I have to believe that matter either is self-existent or it created itself. There's obviously a lot of problems with that. But even when we talk about God creating, is this true? That God creates out of nothing?
yeah, maybe more likely out of himself.
Yeah, okay. It comes from of Him, okay? Now, I get the idea of it, and I think we all understand, right? God creating out of nothing. There was nothing there, and then He creates this thing, but it has to come from something, and it comes from God. And again, the arguments, they're going to say, well, you're just passing the buck to this creator, right? Well, why can't it be matter? And again, logic, reason, whether I want to believe in a creator God or I don't, says it makes more sense that there was a self-existent, all-powerful God who started this thing rather than matter and atoms did it in the right format, and then here we are. So it can't come from nothing. Okay, so when we get into this, the free will, Jonathan Edwards, he specifically is talking about election, but he determines, or he talks about it in the sense that when we are free will agents and we have free will, anytime we make a decision, we always choose based on our strongest inclination at that moment of choice. Whatever that strongest inclination is when we have a choice. There are things that can happen against our will, sure. We can be forced to do things or whatever, but if there is a choice, we will always choose whatever our strongest inclination is. Now, when you get into election, then it's like, well, then how did we choose God if we're evil, if we're tainted by sin and evil? Oh, well, that's where God comes in, right? That's a whole other conversation. But this is that statement that Edwards said, that we're going to choose whatever our strongest inclination is at any given moment or at that moment of choice, also holds true to God in this process. So His strongest inclination in eternity past was to create out of Himself. And so when we make a decision, it doesn't just come from nowhere. It comes from something, and that's R.C. Sproul is going to say it comes from us. We determine it. It's every decision we make is determined. Every decision we make is free. Again, another class. But it comes from something, and it comes from within us. And it's also, that's what happens with God. He decided, I'm going to make and I'm going to create, and so here we go. So out of nothing, again, we get it, but it's also not necessarily true when we really boil it down. It has to come from something, and it comes from God. Okay? That was just kind of a side point. All right. So again, His inclination was to create the heavens and the earth and fill it with His image bearers. So now let's get into a little bit of the Bible, which is always a good thing to do. If I could get a couple readers, I don't know if you guys have your apps ready or open or anything like that. But did you raise your hand? Oh, you've already got your Bible open. Great. If you wouldn't mind just looking at Genesis 1:1 and reading that for me.
Okay. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You want me to just keep reading?
Oh, that's good. Okay, we're introduced to this word, created. In the beginning, God created. In the Hebrew, this is the word bara. All right? or it's an H, but whatever. Bara. That is the word for created. We see it in Genesis 1:1, and we see it in Genesis 1:26, 1:21. Someone mind reading that if you already got it? Go ahead.
So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that move through it according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good.
Okay, so now this is the second time this word bara or created, and this bara or created is what's synonymous with the ex nihilo. That this is out of nothing. Bara, there was nothing, and then God created. Something happens, something changes in that word. And we're going to look at other words that are used in this account that are not the word created. The only other time this is used in this account is then 1:27, which says what? If someone wouldn't mind reading that one.
So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them.
Okay, so in this verse, we have that word bara used 3 times. Okay? Why would that be significant? Yes, repetition for emphasis, which is a big aspect within the Hebrew language. There's only one other word that's repeated, but it's repeated 3 times, but simultaneously. Which word is that? Anyone know? In all of the Bible. We just did it in Isaiah last week, if that helps. Holy, holy, holy. Holy, holy, holy. Right? God's not just holy, and he's not just holy, holy. He's holy, holy, holy. Right? And Jesus says, verily, verily, or truly, truly, I say unto you. It was a way to add emphasis in Hebrew. So the fact that we have that word bara used 3 times in that one sentence is extremely significant. He's trying to point something out in the creation of humanity that differentiates itself from the creation of animals and from just matter and created in general, okay? So it is used again, I will say it is used again in 5:1-2, but this is just quoting 1:27. So it's not a new usage of the word, it's just a recap, if you will.
What's the connection with the Hebrew and the Latin?
This is the created, this word bara is the idea that there was nothing and now there's something new. Something new is being created on the scene. So there was nothing there and now we've got matter. There was nothing there and now we've got life. And there was nothing there and now we've got humanity. Okay? Again, showing the adding the emphasis. So again, something is special about humanity. And then we're going to see very similar in some aspects. You'll notice the differences, but there's a lot of similarity between what I'm about to write and last week looking at the literary framework view. But they're going to call it, oh yeah. I was just talking to a professor, and he was like, I can't do the whiteboard thing. He's like, I have too bad of spelling and penmanship. And I was like, so do I, but it doesn't stop me. I enjoy it. Okay, so differentiation. That this word is used to describe what's happening in the creation account from this perspective, okay? So again, we have created out of nothing. Created is kind of the first point, and then as we get into the creation account, we're going to see God making a differentiation between things, not just create out of nothing. There's now a distinction, a differentiation that's going to be happening. The other word that we're going to see a lot is that word let, right? Let there be light. Let this happen, and it was so. Let it happen. That happens over and over and over again. But it's different. This idea of let is different than bara. These are not the same thing. It is not created anymore. It is let. And as we'll get into in a little bit, we'll hash that out a little bit more even within the Hebrew. So this is a forming of something that's already there. There's now God creates the matter, and then he forms it, or is going to differentiate the things that are there now from one another. And so, as we get into this passage, we're going to see a big part of it is order out of chaos. Order out of chaos. My cousin, I remember when he was younger, his brother was reading a book called Chaos, and he was like, why is he reading a book called Chouse? Like, it's a weird word. Chouse, chaos. All right. So we have order out of chaos, and then if you wouldn't mind going back and read 1 and 2 together, because just if you're reading this literally, like even more literal than what we heard week 1, just listen to this. Okay, go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the
Okay,
water.
pause. So now we have, right here, in these first 2 verses, before we get to the 7 days of creation, what is it that God makes? He makes the heavens and the earth. What else do we know about this earth? There's water on it? What is going on? Right? If we're reading it literally, well, it sure doesn't make any sense anymore. Right? So what's happening? And we get this where we're going to see God making this created order out of the chaos. And water, the waters in this account and throughout the scripture, when it talks about the sea, it's always there. It's synonymous with darkness and even sometimes evil, to the point that when you get to Revelation chapter 21, and God is making all things new, and He says, "And there will be no more sea." There will no longer be a sea. And it's like, well, why in the world would God get rid of the sea? Go ahead.
This might be a really ignorant question because it's been a long days since I had a geography class. But at one point, like there was the whole Pangea, where things,
Sure.
right? Is the assumption? I don't even know when history thinks that it happened. The split. Would some of these perspectives say that happened during these divides? Or was that always during the man years of BC? Does that question make sense?
The Pangea is very, very old. If you were to take the how they get there, let me. You can measure. It's actually pretty fascinating when you look at the poles of the Earth change every 200,000 years or something like that, where the North Pole becomes the South Pole as far as the magnitude, the magnetic pole. And what happens is when, like the pieces of sand and metal in the sand and on the ocean floor, they will actually also then change direction over time. And so they can look at and they can measure from the Marianas Trench over to San Francisco. They can go, well, this is how long, again, if you go to the uniformitarianism, and you go, okay, this is how much land is coming up out of the Marianas Trench in this direction, and then it shifts for so long. It's like a layers. And then go boom, 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 do the math, and there you go. For the East Coast to mash up with the Pacific would take, because what is it we move a year? Like a centimeter a year? The continents are moving. And so to make that go all the way across the Pacific Ocean, or even to go across the Atlantic altogether, it's, tens and millions of years.
So like the young Earth folks would just like throw that out.
No, that's where they would have to say again catastrophism, right? Was there something that the hard part with that is it seems very uniform as you go across the ocean. It could be catastrophism, but as you get water that comes across and striations and all this different stuff, or created with age. God created this to look this way.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Okay, so back to what's that?
I said clear as mud, right?
Yeah, right. Okay, so going back to this chaos and the water, when you get to Revelation chapter 21, God says, I'm going to make all things new and there will no longer be any sea. All right, that's significant because the sea is synonymous with chaos and the wilderness and evil. I remember hearing, I believe it was John Piper. It had to have been because he was talking about that specific verse. And he said, in Revelation, it was like, God's going to get rid of the sea. And he was like, the sea is freaky, right? He's like, I'm from Minnesota. There's 10,000 lakes. Lakes are great. Lakes are phenomenal, right? I go tubing, no problem, in a lake. I'm not doing that in the ocean, like not a chance, right? On my honeymoon, Angela and I, my wife, we oh man, it gives me heebie-jeebies just thinking about it. I remember we were in Mexico, and we were in a cenote. Am I saying it right? Okay. And we went to this cenote, just this sinkhole with the clearest water you could possibly imagine. And I remember the guide was like, just dive in. And I was like, dive in, I'll break my neck. It's 2 feet deep. He was like, no, you couldn't touch the bottom if you tried. And I remember getting in. Have you ever had this experience? Have you ever gotten into one of those things?
Yeah.
And
The peninsula basically has all its water underground.
right.
And so when something breaks the surface for a hole, all the water's underground.
Yeah. And it's just pristine. I mean, it's just crystal clear. So sure enough, we get in and you get your goggles on, you look down and it's just, holy cow, this has got to be 30, 40 feet deep. And you could just see it as if it was right, especially when you're on the surface and you couldn't get the depth perception. But then it goes kind of down into a cave. There's all these caves that all this water goes into, and it went down and it just got pitch black, right? And you're like, man, if this is that clear and you can't see it, right? And so we were like, hey, let's swim over to the side of the cave, let's touch the wall, and then we'll come back. We made it about halfway because you looked down and it was just, like, what is in that? I have no idea. We're going to die on our honeymoon. This is great. And that's the sea. When I think of like, all right, the sea will be no more, but that's what we have happening in the Genesis 1 and 2 account, that in the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth, and his spirit is hovering over the waters of the deep. God is about to do something where he's going to make order out of the chaotic world and universe that there is. Okay? Any questions on that?
What would week 1 have said about how there's earth or there's like water? Like God did say he's making water. Where did the water come from?
It's great. We're getting into that.
Okay, cool.
That's great. Good segue. You guys are really good at that. Okay, so this is where we get into the differentiation or the dividing of these different aspects, okay? And so I don't want there is obviously a literal aspect to this where God is creating things, but he's also, if you can just try to keep this in the back of your mind, he's making this place, this chaos earth that is uninhabitable for human beings. He's trying to make it inhabitable for humanity. Okay, and we'll get into that in a minute. Okay, so I'm not going to write this out, but he's dividing. He's separating here. That's the main aspect. He's not creating anymore. We'll see when he does start to create. But now he's forming and he's dividing. He's making a differentiation in these aspects. Obviously, day 1, you have separating light and dark. On day 2, you have separating or differentiation between the waters above and the expanse below. Oh, let me answer your question. Your question is, where did all that come from? Because if we're getting into the days, if there's stuff there already, right, what's happening, right? Because it doesn't say, and that's where you get into, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's when he did it. That's when he creates bara in Genesis chapter 1. Okay? He creates the land. He creates the water. He creates all this. And then he starts, in the days, starting to make a differentiation between the water that's already there, the chaos that's there, and he's saying, let's do something different here.
So on the first day, because everyone always says, "Oh, the first thing God said, let there be light."
Right.
But really, that's like the third thing. So
Well, that's going to be that's going to be light and darkness is day 1 in the biblical account. But this is going to say, and this is where there gets to be a little bit of overlap between historic creation and gap theory, is that they're going to say that there is a gap in between verses 2 and 3. Right? In the beginning, God creates heaven and the earth, chaos, Spirit of God hovering over the deep. And in between verses 2 and 3, and this is where I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, I think, but when we get into the gap theory, things start to get a little complicated because they start saying that was when Satan fell. You have then the earth starting to decay. You have plant life. All that stuff is already on the earth. I don't know. You can chew on that if you want, but that's going to be the biggest differentiation between historic creationism and the gap theory, is that their main point is that Satan fell during that time of 1 and 2, and that's why it was so chaotic on the earth. Okay?
How would week 1 have explained how all these things are happening in verse 1 and 2? Like all these things happened on the first day?
Well, on day one, again, it's mainly on the differentiation. So on day one, we've got the separation, the differentiation of light and darkness, okay? There would have been stars and planets in the universe doing their thing, potentially, right? If we're taking this as literal in Genesis 1 and 2, and then saying, but now something's going to happen. God's now going to start putting order in this chaotic place, this molten rock that's flying around. And he's going to start making it different from every other planet. And so on day one, you have light and darkness. On day two, then differentiation between the waters below and the waters above, the expanse above. And there is a lot that this is where when that language, if every once in a while you like get on Facebook, if you still do that, and you get some conspiracy theorists that are talking about this dome. Have you ever heard of this, or the firmament? That's a King James translation of the Genesis account. The waters below and the firmament above, and they take that to be, and because it can be translated within Hebrew as like a physical hard firmament, like a dome, like an actual dome. And this is where you get flat earthers. You get people to say, well, there has to be this dome over the earth. NASA, it's all fake. It's yada yada yada. And all of that. It comes from that. That's not what's happening, okay? It's not that word that's being used. It's simply the water below and the sky above. Because we're going to see the sky, that same word that's used in that space, are going to be birds that fly up there. It's the same space, okay? So that's the differentiation. Waters below, sky above. That's happening. On day 3, though, you're going to see 2 different steps of differentiation. One being the land, or the land and the water, right? So now not just the water and sky, now you have the formation of the land and the water. That's the first differentiation. The other aspect of it then is the land and plants, or non-life from non-conscious life, okay? So you have the earth, the dirt, the rocks, all that stuff, but then you have but the word creation is not used. Okay, it doesn't say that God created the plants. He said, let there be, and he forms them. Okay, it's a little bit different. And then you have, so non-life, earth, with non-conscious life that is formed on that. And there's a differentiation there, okay? Then you get to day 4, where you have the day and the night on the earth. And that's where you start to get then, okay, well, the sun was probably there, but now we start to get in, when we look at this, the differentiation, especially as we're starting to make order out of chaos, that now we've got the seasons, we've got ways to navigate, we have the day, we have the sun and the moon and the stars now that are in their proper place to allow humanity to flourish on this planet, all right? 5, you have then the differentiation between conscious life and non-conscious life. Okay, you have the plants now separated from, what is this? That would be the sea, the fish, and the birds. So there's a differentiation there from the plant life that's happening, and the fish and the birds themselves of being separate in those spaces. Day 6, then you have life on earth compared to life in the water and the air. There's a differentiation there. And then the big finale, obviously we get to humanity, and in 126, and God sets man apart from the matter, from earth, from non-life, to non-conscious life with the plants, and then he separates us from conscious life. That's the kind of language they use. They're not saying that dogs are self-aware. I don't think they are. What's that? Sentient life. Yes, yeah. So they're not making that differentiation. They're just saying that there's something obviously different from an animal than a tree, right? And I think we'd all agree with that. That there's a different type of life that God, and that's where God creates that type of life, that differentiation, and then we get to the big grand finale of mankind. And mankind stands out in stark contrast with all of other humanity, right? This is the pinnacle of God's creation. We see this within that verse of it being repeated 3 times in Genesis 1:27. And then we have, within that verse of 127, it says, in the image of God. We're created, humanity is created in the image of God. That is a massive distinction. What have you been taught, or what have you heard, or what do you know, what do you believe about what does it mean that humanity has been created in the image of God? We can just shout them out, make a list. I won't write them down, but.
You mean in contrast to the other animals?
Yeah. What does it mean to be created in the image of God?
The characteristics or the capacity to like be creative, the capacity to be giving up to like make decisions for the better of others that aren't self-sacrificing, like that there's more capacity to display the attributes of God in our interactions with the more social interactions.
Yeah, okay, right. So there's the creative aspect. We have language that animals don't. They obviously can communicate, but they don't have language. Anything else that might come to mind?
Physically, we share some resemblance to what God would look like.
Yeah, potentially, right? If when God takes on form, right? We have a lot of anthropomorphic language that's used in the Bible of a spirit that takes on these different attributes of human beings, but seems to be that there might be something like that in some capacity.
Both like intelligence and also like understanding of right and wrong, good and evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
Some quality of having like a soul or some sort of immortal. When animals die, they're dead.
Yes, right.
Humans and God and are like God, and we continue. So.
Right, and so when we get into, we're not going to get into that tonight, but yeah, when you read the creation account and God breathes the ruach, this breath of life into Adam and brings him to life, that's a really big deal. He doesn't do that when he creates the other created animals. Right? He only does that with humanity. And there's something that happens in that moment that differentiates and separates man from every other kind of created creature. Intelligent, fill in the blank, we're created in the image of God, which is a pretty big deal. Yeah.
Every man and woman is worthy of a high level of respect.
Yes, right. There's human dignity that comes from being created in the image of God. Even people that would say, "Oh man, you're not like me. You don't think like me. You don't live like me. You don't eat like me." You're created. You're an image bearer of God for sure. That's a huge differentiation. That's very drastically different from the animal kingdom, right? I was reading this book to my kids, and if anyone like looked at honeybees, you know how they like do the little dance to like tell where other. You guys know about this?
I've heard of them.
Yeah, they do this. They fly into their hive. They're like, oh man, I found this bouquet of flowers, and they fly back to their hive and they do a little dance, and the other bees follow them. They know how to get there. They don't follow them. They just are like, oh, he gave me like GPS coordinates to get to this thing, and scientists are like, I don't get it. Like we've studied these things forever. It makes no sense how a little bug can do this. It doesn't right now. So there's intelligence to a degree. There's communication, but there are not birds that are building 3-story condos in the woods and renting it out to other birds. Right? It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. There's a drastic difference between humanity and created creatures. Right? And then when we look at even things that are created. They're not a threat to me when I see a machine. Even the whole Elon Musk the robots the iRobot things or the We Robot things that ended up being fake anyways. They were like controlled by people which whatever. They weren't fully run on AI. I'm not worried about it. Right? I'm not worried about of humanity being usurped by some other being, created or not by humans. It's just not going to happen. That God put his stamp on humanity, and here we are. So we are created in a way to relate to God in a way that other creatures cannot. We can speak to him, we can pray to him. He hears us. It doesn't talk about that with other creatures. We don't have any scripture that says, go out to your dog at night and read it this passage. So it doesn't do, there's nothing like that. There's commands about how humans should treat and interact with animals and those created beings, but there's no laws to the animals on how they should behave. There's a unique relationship between human beings and God as their creator. So much so that in the Exodus account, when we get to the Big Ten commandments, we get to the first 4 commandments. Right? Does anyone who we know, class? Can we pass that test? Love. Okay. So no other gods before me. Good.
Idols. Keep the Sabbath holy, and don't profane the name of God.
Well, yeah, okay, good. That's a good summary of them. Good. Okay, now the second one, though, he says, thou shalt not make any graven images. I memorized the Bible in King James. I apologize. Right, but it says, don't make any idols, right? Don't make any graven images. That's a really big deal. Why? What's the point of an idol? What does an idol do?
It's a representation of a.
Okay.
Takes the place of God.
The idol represents that God, that deity, right? And in some way, there is some kind of power or something associated in some way. I pray to this thing to speak to that God. It has some type of spiritual aspect to it. And what else does it resemble in its appearance? The God itself, right? Usually when you have an idol, it is created and it represents that deity, whatever it is. It looks like him. I can pray to it. It has some kind of power to represent that deity. So God in Exodus says, do not make any images of me. Why would he do that? Because what do we hear about this?
We are
the created image, right? So don't blaspheme me and him by creating something thinking this represents me. He says human beings do that, which is why we were commanded, at least Adam and Eve were, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth with images of God. Does that make sense? Human beings, it's drastically different from any other kind of creation when it comes to that. So we are told, we are to fill the earth with image bearers. I'm going to go on a little tangent here, and then we're going to take a quick break. And that is, this morning I did this. I wasn't planning on doing this, but it happened. So this morning, on Sunday morning, I preached this morning. Sundays are long days. And I've been reading through the Chronicles of Narnia series with my son, Henry. And right now we're in the silver chair. And that was why, I read them all in college, but I do not remember this book at all. So I'm like on the edge of my seat. I'm loving it. But this morning I quoted The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where it's such a great line, where Lucy and Lucy, Susan, and Peter are with the beavers. And they're under the understanding that Aslan, everyone's familiar with Chronicles of Narnia enough, right? A little bit. Aslan, within C.S. Lewis' fairy tale world, represents Jesus in this realm, but he's a lion. Okay, but Lucy and Susan and Peter are under the impression that Aslan, they've been talking about this great king, they're under the impression that he's a human. And so they finally start to piece it together. And they go, oh, he's not a human? Like, why would he be a human, right? The king of all the jungle, the king of the jungle is a lion. You know what I mean? Like, what are you talking about? And then they go, oh, man, I would be really afraid to meet a lion, you know? And then Mrs. Beaver is like, yeah, you better believe it. If your knees aren't knocking when you meet Aslan, something's wrong with you. And then Lucy asked the question, but is he safe? And then Mr. Beaver says, did you not hear anything Mrs. Beaver just said? He's a lion. Of course he isn't safe, but he's good and he's a king, right? And that line, I love that description. And this morning it just fit in well because we were going through Isaiah and looking at this lion of the tribe of Judah, but who is also a shepherd, that you also have this lamb that takes away the sin of the world simultaneously, which Aslan does a great job with that. That being said, I want to read an excerpt from Chronicles of Narnia, and this is from The Magician's Nephew. Anyone familiar with this one? Okay. This is a good one. In this book particular, The Magician's Nephew, we have, again, C.S. Lewis writing these books for children, but he's using his deep, vast knowledge of theology and creativity to help us see this aspect of not just the image of God, but the creation. And so I want to read the creation account that C.S. Lewis wrote of Narnia, okay? So just bear with me. I'll do my best to read it where you won't fall asleep. But this is what C.S. Lewis says. And now for the first time, the lion was quite silent. It's Aslan. He was going to and fro among the animals. And every now and then he would go up to two of them, always two at a time, and touch their noses with his. He would touch 2 beavers among all the beavers, 2 leopards among all the leopards, 1 stag and 1 deer among all the deer, and leave the rest. Some sorts of animals he passed over altogether. But the pairs which he had touched instantly left their own kinds and followed him. At last he stood still, and all the creatures whom he had touched came and stood in a wide circle around him. The others whom he had not touched began to wander away, and their noises faded gradually into the distance. The chosen beasts who remained were utterly silent, all with their eyes fixed intently upon the lion. The cat-like ones gave an occasional twitch of the tail, but otherwise all were still. And the first time that day there was complete silence, except the noise of running water. Diggory's heart beat wildly, obviously a character, you don't need to worry about him. He knew something very solemn was going to be done. The lion, whose eyes peered at the animals as hard as if he was going to burn them up with his mere stare, and gradually a change came over them. The smaller ones, the rabbits, moles, and such like, grew a good deal larger. The very big ones, you noticed that most with the elephants, grew a little smaller. Many animals sat up on their hind legs. Most put their heads on one side as if they were trying very hard to understand. The lion opened his mouth, but no sound came from it. He was breathing out a long, warm breath. It seemed to sway all the beasts as the wind sways a line of trees. Then the wildest voice they had ever heard was saying, "Narnia, Narnia, Narnia, awake. Love, think, speak. Be walking trees, be talking beasts." It was, of course, the lion's voice. The children had long felt sure that he could speak, yet it was a lovely and terrible shock when he did. Out of the trees, wild people stepped forth, gods and goddesses of the wood. With them came fauns and satyrs and dwarves. Out of the river rose the river god with his naiad daughters. And all these and all the beasts and the birds in their different voices, low or high or thick or clear, replied, "Hail Aslan! We hear and obey. We are awake. We love. We think. We speak. We know." "Creatures, I give you yourselves," said the strong, happy voice of Aslan. "I give to you forever this land of Narnia. I give you the woods, the fruits, the rivers. I give you the stars, and I give you myself. The dumb beasts, whom I have not chosen, are yours also. Treat them gently and cherish them, but do not go back to their ways, lest you cease to be talking beasts. For out of them you were taken, and into them you can return. Do not do so." "No, Aslan, we won't, said everyone. All right, that's all I'm going to read. I think it's just an awesome rendition, right, of C.S. Lewis saying, wow, here's how Aslan creates these animals in this sense. And what is interesting about them, they become, in this, right, to try to merge the two worlds, they become more human. They start to think, right, that phrase of like, all right, what is we hear and obey, we are awake, we love, we think, we speak, we know, right? There's something that's happening, and they're being made now in this image, but how do they lose their imageness in this pretend world? They lose it when they become more like their animal counterparts. When they stop being this newly created special being. And that's what's beautiful about it, is this carries over into our world. That when we look in people, you can look at the news and turn it on, and you will hear newscasters say they were acting like animals. Right? It's always the phrase that's used. They lost all their imageness of humanity. It left them completely, and it's still true today. And so when we talk about this image of God, it is a big deal. And we become more creaturely, when we act that way. We become more beastly in that sense. So there's something very special about being made in the image of God. Again, not a whole lot of overlap, but I thought it was at least interesting enough. So, okay. All right. Now we're going to kind of just kind of wrap this up with I think what is the main point, and kind of for this perspective of being kind of the aha moment of looking at the creation account and taking it literally. So again, you've got bara, which means what again? Yep, that's going to be the created, and then I don't know how to say this word, but asa. Which this is going to be the word form, or what is the other?
Is this the let there be?
Form is not the right word. That's where we have made or make, which is then also translated in some aspects of like fashion. That aspect, okay? So fashion or shape, form, again, depending on the translation. But that's what they're going to be doing. They're going to be taking that word created, again, only used in those 3 verses. But then everything else, when we have that idea of made, and it's not the word let. It's a different word in Hebrew for let. Actually, I don't even know if Hebrew has a word for let. It's always attached to the action that's happening. Again, been a long time.
It's when the action is imperative.
There you go. Look at this. We got a Hebrew scholar among us. Thank you.
No, I'm not a Hebrew.
This ties into the like without form and void. Like void would be filling the void would be bara created, and without form would tie into like make, fashion, form.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. That's exactly right. So again, the first part aspect, right? God creates the heaven and the earth, the land. Okay. Now, this is where we get into a little bit more of the language, and not just the language, but the why behind it. Within Hebrew culture, not even just Hebrew culture, any culture, and if you were to rewind the clock and try to just interview them, right? You have a microphone and you go, hey, tell me about this place. What do you call it, right? They're going to say, well, this dry stuff that I'm stepping on is earth, right? That is the earth. They're not thinking a globe the way that we think of a globe, right? The first pictures of the earth, which were taken, by the way, weren't taken until the 1960s, maybe the 50s, right? When they had satellites going up. When was Sputnik? That didn't have a camera on anyway, so it doesn't matter. Yeah. So the 60s, right, is when we finally got our first image of this blue sphere, right? They're not thinking that, right? They don't have that in mind. God creates the heavens, this space above, this all that above, the vastness of it, where the stars are, and all that. He creates that, and he creates this thing that we call earth. So that's going through their mind. And that space that is earth and everything above it and all that, it's created without form and it's void. And this is where, again, we get into that language of when we have that word void, it means uninhabitable or wasteland. Okay, so it's there, there's something there, but it's not able to be inhabited by God's image bearers yet. And so God's going to spend a week and he's going to start making order out of chaos. He's going to create and he's going to form and he's going to make this wasteland a place that can be inhabited by his image bearers. So let's look at this. This is used in other places in the Bible. So let's see how other authors use this same language. We'll go to another passage where Moses uses that same language. Would someone mind looking up Deuteronomy 32:10 for me? Deuteronomy 32:10. Anyone got that? Hand raised? Someone's got it? Okay, thank you. Deuteronomy 32:10, and then would someone mind looking up Isaiah 45:18? Isaiah 45:18. Okay, these are just a couple times where that same word is used to not just describe creation account in Genesis 1:1, but other aspects of this wasteland. Okay, so the Deuteronomy account, if you've got it there.
He found him in a desert land, and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him, he cared for him, he kept him as the apple of his eye.
Okay, so in context, which we're not going to necessarily get into, this is about Jacob and God saying, hey, and if you even go back a couple verses above that, there's all this language of like, here's where all the nations were and how God did all this. Great, cool, not necessarily doesn't really pertain to this topic, but it's that same word of this void of wasteland that is in Genesis 1:1, that Jacob was out in this land, and if God doesn't intervene, Jacob dies. That's this idea, all right? The Isaiah 45:18 passage.
For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens. He is God, who formed the earth and made it. He established it. He did not create it empty. He formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, and there is no other.
Okay, well, that seems pretty stinking straightforward, right? He's God. He creates the heavens and the earth, and he created it to be inhabited. Why? Because it was a wasteland. Same word that's used. It was uninhabitable. He makes it habitable. Okay? So, barren wasteland, and God is going to take these 7 days to make it ready for humanity and habitable for humans. Now, in order to do that, if we start getting into the age of the earth and getting into the fossil record, could there be things on the heavens and the earth that were created that would have been very inhospitable to human beings by chance?
Sorry, can you say it again?
Yeah, I'm really bad at asking leading questions like that. Was there anything on this earth that could have roamed the earth? Hey, there we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, there we go. So, yeah, I'm really bad. It's either like I don't understand the question, or you're looking for dinosaurs. That's what it is. What's that? Dodos? Poor dodos. Yeah. Actually, I heard that they just cloned. They made one. It was TikTok, so who knows? But I feel like
I just watched Jurassic Park.
I feel like they did. Did you really?
I really watched Jurassic Park.
The first one?
No, the second one. Why don't we do it again? Like, come on. We learned our. Why don't we learn?
So
the
good.
first time?
Such a good series. Okay, so he is doing this though, and he's saying, hey, maybe some non-friendly aspects of this earth need to be fixed. Okay, there's something it's not broken, it's not bad, it's not evil, but it's definitely not going to work with my image bearers. I just made a big model of a T-Rex for my kids', second grade class, and I feel like I committed a few felonies in doing it because I had to cut a bunch of pennies to do it. I don't know if it's, I don't know. Anyways, it's something. Now it's recorded. Just joking.
Cheap copper.
It's not even real copper because I couldn't cut through the old ones. Okay, so not that I tried. Okay, so God is making this place inhabitable. One of my favorite lines from Jurassic Park, the first one, the OG, there's a line where Jeff Goldblum, who's Dr. Ian Malcolm, he's riding in the truck with Dr. Sadler, Ellie Sadler. I've only watched this movie about 10,000 times. And Jeff Goldblum, they're going out, and it's when, whatever, it doesn't matter. He says, he's sitting there in the truck, and he goes, God creates dinosaurs. God destroys dinosaurs. God creates man. Man destroys God. Man creates dinosaurs, right? He's just kind of going through this process. But then Dr. Ian Malcolm, Dr. Sadler, she goes, dinosaurs eat man. Women inherit the earth. It's such a good line. It's such a great line. I love it. Anyways, right? So hey, if the movies have taught us anything, dinosaurs, humans, not a good mix, okay? And so this is right in line with Jurassic Park, okay? So that means anything. Of just saying, hey, God is making this world inhabitable for human beings. And so let's get into the days specifically. In day 1, we have God creating light, or let there be light. He's not doing that creating, sorry. The word created is not used, okay? Let there be light, and there was light. Now, God is light. And so, and again, if the whole point of this, and what they're going to argue, what I'm arguing now, is that this earth is being made inhabitable for human beings, but God is doing something different with this rock versus all the trillions upon trillions of other rocks floating out there. If there are trillions and trillions and trillions of galaxies, how many trillions and trillions and trillions of rocks are in a habitable zone around, what's it called? It's like a green zone or what?
Goldilocks effect?
Goldilocks effect?
Goldilocks zone.
Goldilocks zone, yeah. of like, hey, we can observe planets around these stars that are in this zone that could be inhabited by some kind of life. Multiply that times infinity, and God says, no, I'm going to let my light shine now on this space. I'm going to have my presence dwell on this space for ultimately the pinnacle of my creation, humanity. It's day one. Day two, obviously separating the waters and the sky, but in this, again, making it habitable for human beings. You now have atmosphere, that aspect. You have breathable air for these creatures, or for humans and other animals. Water from the land so mankind can live somewhere, and then food to eat and cultivate on that land. Day four, again, as I mentioned before, you have seasons and time for man to live by. Day five, the water and the sky animals, and again, that's where we have creation that actually happens there, when he creates life. And then day six, land animals and mankind created in his image. And then you have day seven where he rests. We're going to get into that a lot more next week of the rest and the week specifically when it comes to this creation story of the creation account. And is that significant? And the answer is yes, but we'll get into that next week. Okay, so the whole idea of these 7 24-hour literal days, the whole point, don't get bogged down in the details of what it is, get bogged down in the detail of what God is doing. And he's making this place a beautiful earth in which human beings, God's image bearers, can thrive and reproduce and grow and cultivate. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, other arguments or arguments against other views. So when you get into the evolutionary view, I mentioned it right at the beginning, but macroevolution has not been proven. It hasn't been. And there are, I still get on my feed all the time of Neil deGrasse Tyson. There's this new woman who, she's not new, she was created old. I've never seen her on the scene in the scientific world, I don't know her name. But she's really into like a theory, and she's now saying, hey, we've moved past trying to create life in a petri dish. We're now moving beyond that to say, could life exist somewhere else, right? Okay, cool, great. But they just can't do it. And they sit around and they scratch their heads, and I don't think, maybe it is just a way to say, holy cow, I do not want there to be a God, and so I'm going to do everything I can to prove that there isn't a God, and if I can prove life can exist on its own and be self-created, then there for sure is not a God. This view is as far away from that as possible, that in those 7 days, God does create the animals, and he creates them in their kinds. There is no macroevolution, and that's where this view is for sure going to agree with the young earth creationists, of saying there's no crossing of species. We're not looking at one animal mating with a different kind of animal and then poof, we got that. It doesn't work that way. It never has worked that way. And we can't get it to work that way. And so that's a big part of it. I have a quote here from Stephen Hawking. Anyone familiar with his works, right? Pretty famous atheist, evolutionist, scientist. This was from a book called, by a guy named Francis Scollins, written in 2006. The book is called The Language of God, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. I've not read it cover to cover, so I would assume it's a lot like Dr. Sadler's book that I presented before, at least the second book, which I've also not read. But I'm guessing I'm a scientist, I'm presenting this as evidence for belief, and he quotes in his book Stephen Hawking, and he says this: "The odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think there are clearly religious implications. It would be very difficult to explain why the universe would have begun in just this way except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us." Because he's not a moron. He was a mathematician, and he knew statistics. And when you start getting in all the statistics and probabilities of human beings being the way we are, to think the way we think, to communicate the way we think, to invent the way we invent, you can't just give it enough time and chance, right? We've talked about that before. And he knew that, and even though he still kept going after it his whole life. He died, right? He passed away a while ago. They're going to go after that as long as they can, but it's never been proven. Now, they would argue, well, you can't prove the existence of God either. But to me, again, as we've mentioned, a God who creates animals in their kinds sure makes a whole lot more sense. Again, give microevolution all the time it wants. There are aspects, there are salamanders I remember reading about, and I actually did read this, it wasn't on TikTok. Salamanders that are in caves that no longer have eyeballs, right? Well, why would that be, right? How is it possible that an animal that it like has little spots where eyes used to be, but they don't where there's nothing there, right? Well, how would that happen? Well, after a while, these animals, after this idea of microevolution within its own kind, give that time, all you want. But it's definitely not going to go from a salamander to a frog. It's just not going to happen. It can't happen. So that's that. Another aspect of this that I think is a really good argument when it comes to macroevolution is Mother Nature doesn't have eyes, okay? And so anytime I see a stick bug or I see an animal that disguises itself as another animal, to me, I look at that and I go, holy cow, God is awesome. Because there's no way. There are different, what's the animal that makes itself look like a snake? There's like a bird that makes itself look like a snake, and there's obviously bugs that make themselves look like leaves and all that. Chameleons, right? All these different aspects. But even the process of evolution can't say, wow, I keep getting eaten by birds, so it would help me to look like a stick, and so I'm going to procreate, and then my offspring are going to look more like sticks, and then their offspring are going to look more like sticks. They can't see that. They don't know that, and even if they know that, there's a lot of things about being me that I would not like to pass on to my kids, and if I could figure a way to do that, well, now we're getting weird, but modifying genes and things. Jurassic Park, no. Everything's Jurassic Park. Right, so it just can't happen, right? And to say that Mother Nature has, wow, look at this animal, it can make itself sound like this animal, do all that. Cool, it can do that, but I think it was created to do that. It was created to be that way and display the creativity and glory of God. However, again, all that life was created. And so it was not time and chance, okay? All right, last little bit here. And then the last point here is that the age of the earth, again, already kind of mentioned this, so I don't need to keep saying it. That goes back to what we said last week, or just from science and observing the geology of the earth, that it is old, it has age, and it's really hard to argue against that with really good, solid arguments. You're always gonna run into problems with how do we have starlight? How can we view these things? How can we observe this? And how can we test the rocks to say, yeah, but I believe that. I agree that in this viewpoint, but I also believe in a very literal understanding of what's happening in the Genesis creation account of those 7 days of God making this place habitable for human beings. We'll wrap it up. Well, I shouldn't have said that. It's like a preacher's worst thing to say. It's like my last point. Well, my point's going to be 20 minutes long, and everyone's like packing up. Oh wait, I shouldn't have said that. It is my last point, but no. Briefly here, though, I want to talk next week specifically about why was it written. Right? We've gotten into a lot over the last 3 weeks, specifically on Genesis account, cool, young Earth, old Earth, language, evolution, macro, micro, all that stuff's great. But next week, I really want to get into the why behind it. So again, I'm not going to be presenting a new view or anything like that, but I want to get into why would Moses sit down and write this? Who were his neighbors? Who is he communicating this to? Who's reading this? Who is it written for? And look at kind of a historical, grammatical approach. I'm going to go through probably what my lower towners know a little too well of what's called Scott Duvall's Grasping God's Word, right? You know that? You know what I'm talking about? Like grasp a text in their town, and then yeah. So we're going to kind of go through that. You can doze off during that, and kind of walk through. And the whole point of it is that when we're studying Scripture, Put their shoes on. Put yourself in their shoes. How would they have understood it? Because Moses is not writing Genesis 1 and 2 to combat Darwinism. He's not doing that. Oh yeah, because it wasn't around for 4,000 years, okay? So that's not the point of it. So who's he writing to? What's the point of it? Compare ourselves to our Hebrew neighbors, and then really get into the question of, so what? Does this even matter? And we're going to actually get to Jesus next week very clearly of looking at this whole thing. And if you've been part of Hope for any amount of time, you know that we believe the whole Bible points us to Jesus. And next week, it is so explicit in the creation story in Genesis 1, how it links us to Jesus and points us forward to not just the Creator, but a Creator who loves us and died for us. That's one of, not to bring up C.S. Lewis again, but I'm going to. He wrote Mere Christianity. Has anyone read that? Phenomenal book on apologetics, which it boggles my mind how brilliant that guy had to have been, because it was a radio show, right? He's doing this for like a radio broadcast in the BBC during World War II, and it ends up being like the greatest apologetic ever written. It's like, what? But in that, there's a problem with it where he starts with God, and he doesn't start there, but he gets to God, and then he gets to that there is a creator God, right? And that he really argues from the case of moralism, that we know what's right and wrong and all this stuff, right? And he gets to that. But then you have to make a really big gap from creator God to God loves me and died for my sins. That's a really hard gap to cross, right? And that takes faith. However, I'm going to argue that all of the Bible is saying Jesus, that even the creation account is pointing us to King Jesus, which I obviously get fired up about. It's kind of part of my job. I think it's part of my job description. Must talk about Jesus. I'm pretty sure that exact language is in there. Any final questions specifically on this?
Is that in our job description too?
Whose job description?
We must talk about Jesus.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. We. Christian, we.
Collective
Yes.
Christianity.
Yes, it is.
I wondered how old Earth goes with 7 days. Like humans have been hanging on the Earth for millions or billions of years.
No, so that's where and that you have Genesis 1 and 2, and that in the beginning God creates the heavens and the earth. Boom. And then and that's where the overlap with the gap theory comes in, that you have this, who knows, this is really important, and I forgot. I'm glad you brought this up. The word the word beginning, that word I'm not going to say in Hebrew because I'm just swearing at you. So I'm not going to do that. But the word beginning, when we think of beginning, we think of like the start of something, of right a race, beep, going off, and that's the start. That was the beginning of that thing, right? But it's the same way that we would use language to talk about a story or something that happened a long time ago, like once upon a time. Well, it's an undetermined, indefinite amount of time. It could be 6,000 years. It could be 4.6 billion years, right? That doesn't matter. In the beginning, right? What's the Star Wars in a galaxy far? A long time ago. Okay, a long time ago. Well, how long ago? Well, it doesn't matter, right? It could have been 4,000 years ago. It could have. So we still use that kind of stylistic writing language. That word in Hebrew is that same way of beginning, that it's an undetermined amount of time, okay? So when we have in the beginning, who knows? That could have been created in the beginning. God created the heavens and the earth, undetermined amount of time, long, long time ago, billions of years, give it all the time you want. Other life could have been created during this time, all that, but then when you get to this, and that's that huge gap then, and then when you get to the 7 days of creation, of 7 literal 24-hour days, that's when God starts creating life forms and makes earth inhabitable for humanity.
So in the beginning isn't our modern day definition of start the race.
Correct.
Oh.
Correct. Yeah. So you cannot, based on Genesis 1 and the Hebrew language itself, to determine when was the earth created. It's not what's happening. It's not the point of it. We'll look at what's the point next week, but that's not what the language. You can't even get there just based on the language itself to come up with a date, based on the words that are used. Okay.
So the Earth physically is like millions and billions of years old, but humanity itself is
Yes.
in like that young Earth.
Well, yeah, to a degree, right? I mean, because it doesn't need to be.
Young species that made it.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily need to be based on like genealogies and things that the young Earth is going to do. They're going to say that that idea of the creation of making it habitable for humanity is, in the grand scheme of things, yes, young, but it's not. It's not billions of years, that's for sure.
Wait, so
Yeah.
there's 7 literal days?
Yeah. In those 7 days of God making the earth inhabitable for humanity, it's 7 24-hour days.
So,
But-
can we pull out a Bible and talk this through? I'm confused.
We are?
Like the first half of 1:1, where in the beginning God created the heavens, the earth, and there's the spirit.
Yes. Stop.
And
Hard break.
God created
Hard break.
light.
Hard break,
That's
because-
the sand is the gap. That's the big old gap.
Yes, because here you have
It's all
that.
verse 1. No, verse 2.
Here you have the bara, right? The creation of the matter itself. In the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth. That word created. He creates all the existing matter, and then an undetermined amount of time, potentially. You can be a historic creationism and be a young Earth, right? But I don't know why that would. I don't know why you would do that. Just be creationism. So then this, though, there's an undetermined amount of time that happens here before you get to the 7 days of creation when God says on day 1, let there be light. And he starts going through those 24-hour week period, literally, to create an earth where humans can flourish. Go ahead.
Which would be verse
I'm
30.
wondering,
Correct.
and it may just be because this is the framework, but like, why have 7 literal days in this framework?
And again,
What precludes kind of a synthesis between this and the
There's
last
the-
week's, the literary
And then there was
framework
morning and there was
of light?
evening.
No,
The-
the literary framework.
well, yeah, well, she's given the answer, right? There was morning and evening, and that was the first day, right? So you have the creation of time, and God knows that all the views have to wrestle with the sun and the moon on day 4, and then morning and evening on day 1. You just have to say God knows what He's doing, and He's creating it, and He's getting everything in order. But
So it's just because they was arbitrary, like they fell on the side of we're going to go with morning and evening, therefore 24 hours, as opposed to the literary framework, which says morning and evening, and we're going to take that to be a
Spans of time.
figurative, yep, exactly. The aspect, what it comes down to is that word day, right? And there's no other way to translate day as not day, as in a day. The same way that we use it in our language, that when I say, I'm going to go to Chicago for a day, I mean, I'm going to Chicago for a day. And so when you start getting that language, especially as you're reading it literally, that's why I'm arguing that this is actually the most literal of it. Because if I'm reading this 1 and 2 literally, because if I'm a young earth creationist, I kind of have to just say, well, 1 and 2 is just kind of a synopsis of what's about to happen. This is going to say, no, let's read it. What are these verses here for? And they're here for a reason, and God creates matter on that day, creates out of nothing, and then He creates life, and then He creates humanity.
But I'm still a little confused because
Yeah.
wasn't there a comment that, in theory, dinosaurs could have existed before he started making things inhabitable? But if you only have matter that's not formed into anything, there couldn't be dinosaurs either.
Well, eventually there could be, right? I mean, eventually there could be, but even within this view, when it comes to any kind of animal life, God is still having to make that life. There is no macroevolution. Now, maybe you could argue, well, maybe back then it worked differently. Whatever, who cares? It doesn't matter. But what this does do, not everyone is going to argue this, but what this position does do is in this time, it allows for life to happen on Earth, the same way that any kind of modern scientist would say. But then when we get to the 7 days, that week is when He's now making it for humanity. Go ahead, Sam.
We've really been looking at 2 topics: age of the earth, creation of matter, and life, creation of life. And so I think that the first one, as important as it might be, I think it's helpful if we separate it out
Mhm.
and say, how do you get the first cell?
Mhm.
Well, the first cell cannot be here because of either survival of the fittest, because there's nothing to compete with,
Yep.
and it can't be here because of mutations, because you don't have mutations, you have a cell. So you look at the pieces of a cell, and you say, okay, just like atoms are the building block of matter, amino acids are the building block of life. There's 20 of them, and that's what makes all life.
Mhm.
You cannot get any amino acids by time and chance.
Right.
And even if you could get amino acids, half of them don't work for life.
Hmm.
And so you have this mixture that if you try to put it together, it's not going to work.
Right.
Even if you could get the right amino acids to connect, which you can't, that does not produce the proteins. It's impossible.
Mhm.
And even if you get the right order, then they still have to fold up, which always happens within a cell. It never happens out in nature. So I think the important thing is that scientifically, you can never, and you said this, I heard that,
Mhm.
you can never, ever start life without a creator.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so that's where you get into, when you start getting into these 7 days, then that's where you have the creation of life itself.
So there wasn't life in those first.
Well, there could have been. It leaves it open to that. But if there was life here, it's not from an evolutionary reason. If there was life there, it was because God created it and He put it there. And then He said, I'm going to choose this rock.
We don't like them.
Yeah, I'm going to choose this rock and I'm going to make this rock for humans. And these things got to go.
Did he remake life then? Like everything that was there was wiped out and he just started over?
Well, not everything, right? Because what, crocodiles were still around right there.
That's my question. Is
Mhm.
remaking
Mhm.
all of a sudden in the literal 7 days, like light and plants and separating things? That
Mhm.
doesn't make sense with the idea of there already having been.
Well, there were, but a lot of these things, and there is a lot of destruction that would happen if that was the case, if life and things existed in that sense. But what's happening here, though, is a major upheaval and a change of what was there, if there was life, to make it ready for human beings. And so some of those things, hey, I mesh with just fine. I like trees. Trees are cool. Great. That survives. That makes it across. But other aspects and species and of plants and animals, we did talk about a little bit in the young Earth aspect of just the atmosphere changes. Something drastically changes on planet Earth. So
So would most people who hold to the sort of gap view, would most of them say there probably was not life during the 1 and 2?
I don't know. I don't know if I could answer would most. Some would, some wouldn't.
But 1 and 2 would be where we get the old Earth from.
Right. You have old Earth here, but as Sam was saying, life itself, God has to intervene. There's no other way around it, biblically speaking, within biblical orthodox, to get to life existing without God. Yeah, Sam, you were going to say something.
I just think it's also possible that verses 1 and 2, there's still no life.
Right. Yes, exactly. This could just be a molten orb of whatever, of mass, and then in the 7 days, that's when God creates. And this is where you get into the young Earth of dinosaurs. Dinos were here, created on day 6, just like everything else, but it still allows for old Earth. Right? Okay, good. Thank you for pointing that out.
Are you probably more for next week? Are you gonna talk about like traditional Jewish belief?
Of the creation account? Yeah, I will. And
Like modern Jewish belief and like how I don't know how much that overlaps. I don't know how much people thought about this like thousands of years ago. They're just like God created Earth. That sounds good.
well, and that's why it gets into the why behind it. I think it will answer that. Why is Moses doing this, right? Was he thinking as he's writing this down that holy cow, in 4,000 years they're going to be talking about this and lecturing this and debating this, going back? I don't think that was his point, which we'll get into next week a little more.
I'm curious about the other question though. Like, does people who practice Orthodox Judaism, for example, do you know where they would fall on any of this?
You know, I will write that down. I don't know off the top of my head. I do know that they, I don't know what specific aspect, but they are going to, I don't know. I don't want to say anything and then go ahead, Sam. Sam knows.
Comment, I'm half Jewish again.
There we go.
But, you know, your question is impossible to answer. Because it's like saying within the whole realm that might be called Christian, which most people like
What do
to
Christians believe?
Yeah.
tell me what the Christian view on Genesis is right now.
Yeah.
You can't do it. There's just too many subdivisions, and Judaism has a lot of them too.
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, I think that when we start comparing it with other neighboring communities and their creation stories, I think that this starts to make a lot more sense of. We'll get into why. What was the point of it?
Like you'll talk about other world religions next week?
I don't know about world religions, but I will talk about other nations.
Oh, at that time.
Yes,
Oh, okay.
yes. Which they did have religion, but
Yeah. But I was wondering, like, what does Islam believe? Because they're Abrahamic, but
right.
different.
Yeah, no, we're not. I'm not going to get into current belief systems, but more ancient stuff.
We'll send one last question, I
Yeah.
guess. Is there like a belief or a viewpoint that would say that like God created and God formed in the way that we talked about tonight, but without it being literal days? So like where it's like
Well,
1
that's-
and 2 could still be older.
Well, and that's where you get into the day-age theory or the gap theory of in between, right? But again, that word "day," man, it throws a wrench in the whole process. Yeah.
Sure, it makes more sense to either hold it as like fully literary or
Yeah. Yep.
literally
just
a day.
an analogy,
Yep.
or it is.
It's hard to try to mesh those. Yeah.
Sure. Which is why the day age and the like don't hold a lot of.
Yeah.
We don't have a lot of people who promote them.
Right. Took a breath. He's like, I'm ready to go. That was my breath. No, I'm joking. All right. Any last thoughts? Okay.
A lot of this, I'd say, a little bit of a thought. Like a lot of it kind of ties into like how you define like inerrancy of the Bible as well. Kind of comes into play of like whether or not you. I guess that's kind of just like the literal versus literary kind of interpretations.
So if it's figurative, that's still
Well, yeah, like inerrancy could be that like just two definitions that I know of inerrancy. One being just like everything in the original text is like 100% accurate, and then I also have heard like everything in the text is comprehensive of everything you need to know about God to form like a appropriate faith and belief in that.
Yep. Yeah. So there's a little nuances between infallibility and inerrancy, but inerrant is like you said, and if you read our statement of faith, that's what it's going to say, that they were without error in the original manuscripts. It's kind of a gotcha thing because we don't have any original manuscripts. But we added a point in our elder statement of faith that adds some clarifying aspect to that to say, well, but we can trust our Bibles. There's no doubt in my mind, all the studying I've done that says hey, our Bible is exactly what we have, exactly the way that God wanted us to have it. There's debate on it, but not within the Christian world. On specifically on that we're going to say there is no errors. What we have in Genesis 1 and 2 is what Moses wrote down and has passed on for generations for us to have. The question then goes back to, well, then why did he do it? What was the point of it, right? And if it's the point to debate the age of the earth, the answer is no. Now, it's fun to do this class, obviously. It's fun to talk about it. It's fun to get into it. But is that the point of Genesis 1 and 2? No, it's not. At least that's what I'm going to argue as a pastor. So, all right, let's call it for tonight, and then we'll see you next week for our grand finale, and hopefully, well, we will. We'll get to Jesus. So thanks, everyone, for being here. We'll see you next week.